Do you take responsibility for failing to stop this fraud in your state?
Well, certainly I take responsibility for putting people in jail. Governors don't get to just talk theoretically. We have to solve problems. And I will note, it's not just Somalis. Minnesota is a generous state. Minnesota is a prosperous state, a well-run state. We're AAA bond rated, but that attracts criminals. Those people are going to jail. We're doing everything we can. But to demonize an entire community on the actions of a few, it's lazy. And as you heard Senator Kelly say, this president has cut a lot of inspector generals. He's cut programs that could help us tackle this on. So we'll take it on. We'll put folks in jail. I don't care what your nationality is. I don't care what your religion is, your color. If you're committing crimes, these are programs that were meant to serve students with autism, to housing, and to making sure people had enough to eat. There's a reason Minnesota ranks as the top, lowest childhood poverty, best place for children to live. People are taking advantage of that. They're going to prison. That is totally disconnected with demonizing an entire group of people who came here fleeing civil war and created a vibrant community that makes Minnesota and this country better. But that's Donald Trump. Deflect, demonize, come up with no solutions. He's not going to help fix anything on fraud.
Yeah, we know.
My God, there's a big difference between fraud and
enough.
corruption.
By the way, this is a guy who said in that commentary, I think, the fact that it was a well-run state makes it attract criminals. Pretty sure that's not true. He did say also that it was AAA bond rated. So maybe the criminals are just like, hey, we got to find a AAA bond rated state. It's really important to us. Yeah, White House has responded, yes, there's something wrong with Walz, and it costs taxpayers $1 billion. Dozens of individuals, largely of East African descent, looted taxpayers out of over $1 billion intended for child food assistance and what amounted to the country's largest pandemic relief fraud scheme. The Trump administration is terminating temporary protected status for Somalis indefinitely, halting migration from third world countries, re-examining green cards for every alien from every country of concern, pausing asylum decisions, and more, all as a part of this relentless effort to ensure migrants that remain are a net positive for our society. Of course, that should be the goal of every migrant. You're going to let people come into the country. They should be helping you along. I'm sure that you know someone who migrated to this country who you find to be a positive influence on it. I know many. There's lots of them here. It does not mean that everybody who came here is a bad person or is hurting our country. It does not mean that every person who came here, even from Somalia, is doing damage to our country. Sure, there are many wonderful examples that escaped a civil war and have done great things. That being said, a lot of these people are not the examples of that situation. And we need to do something about that, not ignore it because we feel bad to call people names because we're worried they might think we're racists. That's how your country falls apart. And of course, when you think of a country falling apart, you think of Tim Walz. By the way, it wasn't just Tim Walz, we should note. Keith Ellison also has an interesting connection to this. Feeding Our Future, Keith Ellison caught on tape. Keith Ellison, Minnesota's Attorney General, can clearly be heard pledging his support to individuals who would soon become his family's campaign donors and later feeding our future criminal defendants. His recorded statements flatly contradict his contemporaneous public statements and raise uncomfortable questions about the intersection between political fundraising and constituent services. So what's being done about all of this? Because there's a lot. Treasury is investigating whether Minnesota welfare money went to al-Shabaab, the terror group, according to Scott Besson. He said, at my direction, U.S. Treasury is investigating allegations that under feckless mismanagement of the Biden administration and Governor Tim Walz, hardworking Minnesota's tax dollars may have been diverted to terrorist organization al-Shabaab. That's just one part of this. Federal funding in Minnesota is at risk after review finds issues with commercial driver's licenses. In another scandal, Sean Duffy says it keeps getting worse for Governor Tim Walz. Just one day after 400 brave employees from Minnesota DHS exposed massive fraud, U.S. DOT has discovered that 1/3 of non-domiciled CDLs were issued illegally in the state. Minnesota, you're on notice. You have 30 days to fix this or lose $30 million in federal funding. We also have this. Claire Lancaster, a spokesperson for Minnesota Tim Walz, said we take safety on our roads seriously, and the Minnesota Department of Public Safety has already worked to ensure they are in compliance with federal law. It's interesting. Every one of these things we find out, they say, well, we've already fixed that one. Sure, it went on for a really long time and we did nothing. But now you can trust us because, you know, our governor is that idiot that you keep seeing on television, one of the worst vice presidential picks in the nation's history. You should trust him because he's trustworthy. Sure. By the way, latest development, this broke maybe 10 or 15 minutes before we started taping. Feds plan operation in Minnesota focusing on Somali immigrants, according to the Associated Press. So President Trump has taken this really seriously, and that is great. The government seems to be working in that direction. And look, again, people who didn't do anything wrong shouldn't be targeted because they came here from Somalia if they came here legally. If they came here illegally, they should be targeted and they should be exported, deported out of this nation as soon as possible. Anyone involved in this scam should go to prison for a long time. Whether that will happen or not in Minnesota is a question, and that's why the feds have to get involved. Jim Garrity writes this for the Washington Post. Tim Walz is crumbling along with his 2028 hopes. I guess my question would be, he has them? He has hope? Really? Like, are we talking about the presidential election or just the fact that 2028 occurs? Like, he's hopeful that 2028 occurs as a year. I don't know. If he's thinking about the presidency, he should stop thinking about it. Past year has not been kind to Walz. Kamala Harris's recent book, 107 Days, makes clear she was thoroughly disappointed by Walz's performance as a running mate. She describes watching him in the vice presidential debate on TV and saying, "You're not there to make friends with the guy who is attacking your running mate." This is, of course, a small part of the problem with Tim Walz. The fact that he was actually a little nice during the debate really has nothing to do with his performance. And by the way, she stated at the beginning, the reason she picked him is she was overtired. Well, I was really overtired that day. That was her excuse as to why she picked Tim Walz. Walz's approval rating in Minnesota, the governor, is evenly split. But keep in mind, it's a heavily Democratic state. The gubernatorial primary is until June. If you're a Minnesota Democrat, do you really want to roll the dice on a not-so-popular guy going for a rarely pursued third term? Republicans are likely to nominate Lisa DeMuth, the state's House Speaker, who's already hitting Walz because he let fraud run wild. If Walz is sweating re-election in what is traditionally one of the safest states for Democrats, maybe it's time to conclude that he was a lousy pick as Harris's running mate and doesn't merit serious consideration by Democrats for the 2028 presidential nomination. I mean, in typical Jim Garrity, understated form there, because they definitely should not be considering him in any way. And remember, we started this headline, this whole thing, with how fraud swamped Minnesota's social services on Tim Walz's watch. One thing that's interesting about that headline, that's the New York Times headline, is I think it's the New York Times saying, let's get this out there so people know and don't consider Tim Walz as an option. Now, I don't think you really need to do that before the primary. I think even Democratic voters have to be smarter than that. They can't possibly think, we should go back to that well. You know, the guy who absolutely sucked in the last campaign. It's not impossible that they would think of something like that, but I don't think anybody, I don't think there's any love for Tim Walz. You know, when you lose a race, sometimes people say, gosh, if only he won. If only she won, right? That happens sometimes. There's a bit of that with Kamala Harris, not a lot. There's none of it with Tim Walz. There's none of it with Hillary Clinton. Neither one of those they want to look back to at all. Kamala Harris, I think, they don't like, but they don't necessarily blame her as much as I think even Tim Walz. I think Walz is a guy who was, that role was really seen as something that could have either been a complete Hail Mary, right? You throw the ball up in the end zone, hope your team comes down with it, even though you're not necessarily expecting to win. I don't think they were expecting necessarily to win with Kamala Harris at the beginning. But I think, if they had picked somebody else, maybe they would have had a chance or a better chance. Secondarily, I think that was looking to launch someone out of that slot. Josh Shapiro being the more obvious candidate. They didn't go that direction, and now they have nobody. Now they're kind of like, Gavin Newsom, maybe? And if that's, he's by far leading the pack for 2028 candidates. If that's the person you're looking to and you're thinking this is a good option, you're obviously horrifically desperate, right? Or you are married to Gavin Newsom's best friend and you're thinking about hooking up with him because that's what he does with his best friend's wives. That's a totally different story, not one we're talking about right now.